Early Marx 101 is the next big Philosophy Portal course. The course starts June 9th and will unfold throughout the rest of 2025. The course will include 7 lectures on the early Marx's writings from 1840s and include discussions and Q&A opportunities, indefinite access to recordings, as well as special access to portal sessions related to Marxism, capitalism, and socialism. Philosophy Portal courses also lead to opportunities to learn presentation skills and writing opportunities at our conferences and anthologies. Work at this theopolitical edge on these topics is more important than ever, and without engagement with the specific historical contradictions that appear at the site of modern democracy and industrial capitalism, we'll be unable to address or adequately engage with them. To learn more about the Early Marx 101 course or to sign up, visit philosophyportal.online. All right, welcome to another philosophical conversation. I'm Cadell Last, and I'm here today with Dimitri Crooijmans. Dimitri has been longtime collaborator of Philosophy Portal, currently leading a reading group at Philosophy Portal on A Voice and Nothing More by Mladen Dalar. And we're going to discuss the early Marx today because Philosophy Portal is leading a course starting on Sunday, June 9th, and unfolding throughout the entire year. You can join at any time on the early Marx, mostly his writings from the 1840s. We're going to start with the critique of the philosophy of right, because last year we did a course on Hegel's philosophy of right, so there's definitely a conceptual linkage there. And I think the way I want to start the conversation, Dimitri, is that we've been doing this work at Philosophy Portal now for about 3+ years. And throughout each of those years, we've been leading courses on Hegel's foundational work. You could even think about it as a kind of triad of his main works, like Phenomenology of Spirit, Science of Logic, Philosophy of Right. You've got the sort of the phenomenology angle, obviously. You've got the logical angle, and then last year, Hegel's political angle. And what's interesting when you get into the early Marx is that you can not only see, obviously, how much of Marx is influenced by Hegel. He was a part of the young Hegelians. And he's clearly read the systems, and he's clearly internalized the systems, the systems of the phenomenology, the logic, and the politics. But what's really interesting is that Marx seems to be going straight into the political, obviously, and he's kind of inverting Hegel's system on the level of the political, which I think is incredibly interesting. And it's one, and to be completely transparent, of all the critiques of Hegel and of all the inversions and the negations of Hegel that pop up and have popped up since Hegel, Marx's have been the most profoundly impactful, and they've been the most generative in terms of not just philosophy, but, politics and other things. So really the transition we're heading into with the early Marx is this relationship between philosophy and practical politics. But of course, historically, this transition has always been between Hegel to Marx in a linear way. And I think that the way, at least that I'm going to be approaching teaching the early Marx, is trying to think about the relationship between Hegel and Marx as a non-orientable surface. So thinking about, and this was first inspired by Zizek, where he has this brilliant method in Less Than Nothing, where he says, we should ask ourselves these questions of, what would the dead philosopher say to the living philosopher who's critiquing him? Like, what would be the retroactive move? So, like, what would Hegel say to Marx if he had a chance? Because when we always learn philosophy, we always learn it in a kind of linear way of sort of a living philosopher responding to dead philosophers. So I do think that there is an interesting opportunity here for thinking, and it's a generally interesting method, but also inspired by the work, and that's sort of the philosophical angle, but also inspired by the work of someone like Chris Catrone, who is inviting us back to think about Marx in between 1848 and 1917, basically that period before the Russian Revolution, because that period of Marxist thought is obvious. Well, that is the period of Marxist thought. And then after that period, after the Russian Revolution, I think, Catrone says we're traumatized by it. So that, like, in a psychoanalytic sense, you could say, like, we can't see the prehistory of the Russian Revolution clearly. because we're so traumatized by what happened in the Russian Revolution and what ended up with with Stalinism, that when most people think about Marx and when most people talk about Marx, what they're really talking about is not Marx. Like they're talking about like 20th century communism, right? And I think that that's kind of the window, and like these are kind of the angles that I'm going to be taking when going into. And then as final thing before just throwing it to you, is another thing that I like in Catron is that he frames Marx as a problem and a question as opposed to an answer or a solution. So I'm not going into this course thinking we can recover the original Marxist text and we can start that we can really do the communist revolution. I'm much more looking at Marx as kind of, a practical political thinker of his time, wrestling with specifically the tension between national democracy and the nation state and industrial capitalism, and posing a problem or posing a question which has only intensified in the last 250 years with waves of industrial production, artificial intelligence. Now we're talking about technofeudalism and stuff like this. So this is kind of, the invitation and the opening here at Philosophy Portal with the early Marx course. But, I've said a lot there. Let me know what you think.
There is indeed there's a lot there. So yeah, thanks for inviting me for this conversation. Yeah, this is really explosive territory that we're gonna get into, right? Because Hegel, if anything, can seem as a maybe like an innocent type of thinker, right? Like if people have any association with Hegel, and I'm talking about people who didn't read Hegel, it's probably that, okay, Hegel's a bit dusty, he's very old, Germanic type of stuff. But when you come to Marx, immediately you get questions of, well, what about Lenin? What about the violence? What about the dictatorship of the proletariat and uh, and the working class revolts, right? So yeah, this is really explosive, and um, Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution. These are traumatic points, right? Like if you want to really have a discussion on the base level of how people or leftists think politically, like just open up a conversation about Lenin and you'll see it going that way, or this way or that way, in whatever direction, right? Like take Catron and Zizek, who don't really want to salvage Lenin, but who do want to repeat Lenin, and for Zizek, it's not just repeating Lenin as a great Marxist. Zizek says that uh, Lenin betrayed Marx in a way. Lenin was an opportunist. He wasn't an orthodox Marxist. He did a revolution in a country that was basically full of peasants, right? It wasn't the forefront of industrial capitalism. So yeah, this is like a very weird Leninism that we find in Zizek. Of course, Catron handles this in his own way, which is not clear cut in any direction, right? Then, of course, there's also Marxism, Leninism. People self-identify with that. Nowadays, they do too. I mean, take the biggest political party in the world, which is what is the Communist Party of China, which it has a membership of 100 million people. Right? That is more than the population of Germany, of people who, to be a member, they have to identify with Marxism, Leninism. Now, of course, I'm not saying that, these are all, let's say, believers, and they passionately believe in whatever that means from the heart. But yeah, Marx is is haunting us, right? This like communism as a specter has been haunting Europe for the last 200 years, and has been haunting the globe. So yeah, I mean, the fact that Marx is really the singular most important critic of Hegel is massive, and really yeah, it asks of us to do work and to be very patient too with it. So what you said about Marx is a problem and is a question as opposed to an answer. Marxism is not an activist answer to the impotence that we are in. And I mean, let's step back. What am I saying when I say impotence? Very simply, what does the proletariat mean? It's a term that has arisen in the Roman times, and it meant civilians who did not have property. And today I'm a civilian of, of the Netherlands, of the EU, but I don't have property. Well, what I do have is my labor power, and I can sell this, right? So we are in a situation in which there is a proletarization, and more and more property is concentrated in smaller and smaller groups, right? So Marx is a type of thought that wants to address this, and the fact that this will have massive not only consequences, but it shows a self-destructive tendency of capitalism. So that's look. So what I'll say is, like, Marx as a problem, as a question, doesn't mean that Marx is totally correct in his analysis of capitalism, or what people take to be his prescriptive answers to it, but it gives us a way of thought, a method to really think this through. So in the introduction of the philosophy of right, Marx starts off by critiquing philosophy as such, especially German philosophy, and not only German philosophy, but especially what he sees as the highest form of German philosophy on the level of politics, which is Hegel's philosophy of right. This is like the highest principle of bourgeois politics in a philosophical form. So for Marx, he says that critique, like the critique of religion, is the prerequisite to all political critique, and that, of course, partly inspired by Feuerbach, Marx is interested not in God as a self-contained entity, but he wants to reduce religion to a phenomenon of the self-relation of mankind on Earth, which is political, but which has to be critiqued to really develop a political critique, right? A political critique of society, of bourgeois society. And so Hegel wrote the philosophy of right. And right is a very sticky concept, not only in a judicial sense, but let me draw out one thing with right here. So rights, of course, started with civil rights, rights of the citizen. So not rights of women and not the rights of slaves, but the rights of citizen, right? And especially after Marx, and if you look at the UN Charter, it's not only about the rights of the citizen, which are in relationship to a certain city, which also might have rights, or a certain country, but it's about human rights. And the difference between the rights of the citizen and civil rights and human rights is massive, because human rights presuppose a type of global order. For example, the right to self-determination. Palestine is, of course, the first thing that comes to mind here. Do they have self-determination? Well, according to the UN Charter, they're justified in their resistance, right? So this is something that comes from the notion of human rights. And this is a legality on which they also legitimize their resistance. This is what these people do. So, but then again, who is in control of those human rights? Well, yes, the UN, but we all know, right, that the US empire is basically at the forefront of global imperialism. And so to think through right, and to think through how Marx himself responded to the notion of right, both civil rights as well as human rights, it's so crucial. And what I really appreciate about Philosophy Portal is that we're not just we're not just reading Hegel as in that's an interesting text, but we're reading Hegel politically. But then we're also not just reading Hegel; we're going to read Marx, but not only Capital to say, we've read the big the big books and now we can be great Marxists. But it's like we're going to take Marx seriously, and we're going to really want to. We'll be going into all of the most important texts by him, and to see how he has developed his thought from the young Marx to the old Marx. And you know, taking our time with this, having this patience of the concept, and not trying to extract political slogans from it immediately, but really to do political thinking as like as a political deed. That's radical today. That's radical today. And I think that really in itself is already a liberation, right? To like, and that's a Hegelian way of thinking, to see thought as a liberation, and to see the thinking of limits and the thinking beyond limits, and like how do we think that to see that as a liberation itself is definitely a Hegelian gesture. So Marx's critique, for me, to put it in a simple sense, lies in taking that taking that speculative philosophy of Hegel and then making it down to earth, right?
Yep.
Practical, political life. That's what it's about. So yeah.
Yep. All of that. I think that sort of on a meta reflection where I want to start is that I have experienced throughout my life that thought and conceptualization is a liberation. I've always felt that way, and that's why I do what I do. That's why I've done what I've done since I was an early adult. I think that what has appeared in my life as kind of a symptom is thought and conceptualization as a liberation, but thought and conceptualization as a liberation in and for itself does not provide me with the basic material foundations for my life and for example, having a family, like first and foremost. So like we can stop with there, like let alone building a family that can then interface with other families and build communities and civil society. So I think that for me is where the basic symptom and non-orientable surface of Marx and Hegel appear to me, is completely accepting the Hegelian liberal disposition of thought and conceptualization as a liberation, precisely. But then again, this question of the basic material foundations, and that's how Marx starts the critique of the philosophy of right as well, is that he's basically, as far as I interpret him, he's not against philosophy. He's not even against Hegel as such. He might be clearly against Hegel's idea of the state. That is clear. But he's not, I don't think, against Hegel's philosophy as such. The weird thing, though, and this is kind of like bringing this tension to today, is that, and I'm going to specifically here refer to Western thought, Europe, North America, that Marx is starting off his project by going against philosophy in a certain sense and demanding that we put our attention to practical politics. And I think the paradox of Marxism in the West, again, like Europe and North America, is that primarily Marx has an impact in philosophy, but not so much in practical politics. Like it's hard to like plug in, so to speak, to like Marxist practical politics in the West, but like, you could find like Western thinkers who are thinking in a Marxist way philosophically. So I don't know how Marx would think about that, right? But that seems to be the way it is, at least at the moment. And I guess the way I've interfaced with that in my career, so like starting with, like, for example, the introduction to Real Speculations, is that I do see the problems that Marx is posing as forcing themselves back into political consciousness. Like, we do have to confront Marx as politics again. And what I mean by that is that in the 21st century, I see the dialectic of new atheism as opening the critique of religion, in the same way that Marx is saying the critique of religion is the start of the critique of politics. So, like, new atheism in the 21st century opens the critique of religion, but new atheism never gets to the critique of politics. So it's like completely aborted in that sense. And where we find it aborted is, I think, in the Peterson moment, where Peterson just gets stuck in religion in a very kind of like regressive, confused way. And he even makes this weird straw man of socialism as like the key symptom blocking any critique of politics. So, like, I really think when I analyze like the frontier of intellectual conversations today, like that, like this dimension of German idealism and Marxism is forcing itself back to us in the unconscious, whether we like it or not. Like, it's like a script that you couldn't even write it. Like, it's writing itself. Like, the unconscious is way more intelligent. Like, the unconscious is writing this out. Like, that's where I see these tensions breaking open. And what I always, I'll say a few more things before throwing it back to you, but what I always appreciated in Marx when I first started reading Marxist philosophers and, acquainting myself with the tradition a little bit, is that it definitely breaks you out of the big other of liberalism and neoliberalism. Like, you start to realize that all of the thinkers that you're paying attention to in whatever field are kind of overdetermined by this mode of political thought. And it kind of opens things, it opens your thinking in a very important way, but also a very dangerous way, because you don't know how to handle that gap between like all of the liberal thinkers that you've benefited from and that you like are like respectful thinkers, but at the same time they're kind of blind to this overdetermination. And then there's Marxism, which is like quite radical from the point of view of the liberal thinkers you've been reading, but at the same time it opens you to ideas that seem true in like a deep sense, even if they seem true in the sense of this gap between thought and conceptualization as a liberation versus the basic material foundations being so dramatically inadequate to that liberation. And then you kind of get stuck there in that antinomy in a way that seems impossible to overcome. Like, you could find yourself in a situation where you're like, oh, like, I feel like I'm stuck at this antinomy, and I feel like this antinomy is not going anywhere. And like, you start to think, is this going to be the antinomy that I'm going to live my whole life in? Like this is not going to be overcome. Like, this is just where I find myself as a historical subject. But then the final point is, you mentioned the origin of the term proletariat. And you mentioned that you have your labor power to sell. You don't have property, but you have your labor power to sell. And we've both, I think, been influenced by Helen Rollins and her idea that the middle class is radically proletarianizing today. And I've also been following the economist Gary Stevenson on the idea that we're losing our assets, generationally speaking. So, like, the baby boomers could have a working class job and own property. Gen X could have a working class job and own property only with help from their parents. Millennials, if they have a working class job, are never going to be able to own property, probably. And then Zoomers, good luck. Like, it's just like, complete catastrophe, complete social breakdown, of any, relationship between your labor and your labor time and the possibility of ever owning property. So I feel like this is all the weird explosive mix where, going back to the early Marx from a Hegelian perspective and taking time to think through these tensions, is where, Marx and the problems and the questions that he's pointing towards are going to explode, I think, in a more intensive way, potentially in the next 5 to 10 years. And I kind of see us as preparing for that. So I'll throw that back to you.
Oh yeah, and that's like we should never forget that in the day and age of Marx, there were huge working class movements without Marx and Engels doing anything about it, right? I'm not saying they
Exactly.
were active,
So
right?
good.
They also co-founded the First International, yada yada. But we don't have a working class movement. We don't have that. And so are we do we have to get into activism to be in the forefront of it when it emerges? I can recommend people looking at Paul Matic. He actually is one of he's a left communist who lived through the German Revolution, then became an immigrant to the United States. He was horribly abused there, but he lived through the Great Depression there. And what he said, being there in the Great Depression, was that um, so there would be lots of hunger, right? Like there would be trucks in the city of Chicago, in major US towns, and these trucks they would ride around the city just to pick up all the corpses under the bridge, just on the side of the street, like weekly. This would just be one of the things that happened during that era in the United States. So he's also saying that there were huge demonstrations, so big that the police couldn't even pull their gun because their shoulders would just be crunched up, crushed in the whole populace. Everyone would be on the streets. And he's saying there would be all this energy, but no organization, no channeling of that energy. And I'm reminded here by what Trotsky says. Trotsky says that the the proletarian movements are like steam, right? The energy of the masses is like steam. It's very powerful, but only if you channel it. Otherwise, it just dissipates into thin air. So Matic was there as a very, learned communist. He read all the primary text. He lived through the German Revolution. He knew a lot. He was in contact with all these people, and he was there. Seeing all these masses hopeless, dying, rising up, and there was nothing to do. He was seeing that, and so honestly, if I'm thinking about the future and especially the fact that we're headed toward mass unemployment, I'm thinking about these type of things, and like the fact that there who knows what will happen, but if people will rise up, let's not assume that it will be channeled by the organizations that already exist. There will be opportunists rising up, there will be people splitting, who knows what type of political identities will be taken up. And I definitely think that, yeah, we are seeing more and more people becoming religious, but we're also seeing more and more people becoming explicitly socialist and communist and creating political parties and all of that. So
And fascist.
and fascist too, of course. Yeah,
Extreme
of course.
politics. Extreme
Yeah,
politics is in our future.
extreme politics is our future, and also like an non-orientable chaos, right? It will not be like it will grant awakening. I don't believe in these type of things.
And
So
this proletarian energy that is very powerful, but only if you channel it. We should always remember that the fascist orientation has an advantage in the channeling because I think it's more instinctually appealing to, like, the fascist channeling is more instinctually appealing. The
yeah,
communist and the socialist appeal is much more abstract. It's much more, it requires more, it does require dialectics. Like
yeah.
you can't actually think it without that.
I think yes, totally. I 100% agree with this, and I would say that I became a Marxist when I was a teenager. I read the Communist Manifesto, and I think that it was a big disillusionment. That wait a second, I, that's how I experienced it. I was like, wow, class struggle is determining society. Capital is determining society. Whatever people say and stuff like this, it's like, what about the underlying class struggle? What about liberal and capitalist ideology underlying those things? And so there is this. The fact of Marxism is that it is a partial perspective, right? So one of the traps of Marxism it's a trap, but it can be a blessing, is that when you are a Marxist, if there is a resistance to your Marxism, you can say, well, that's because it's bourgeois. That's because it's liberal. That's because it's fascist. That's because it doesn't see into the fundamental logic of capital or the fundamental logic of class struggle, which is actually underlying it. And that partiality of Marxism is, it can be a huge trap, but it's also really where Marxism gets its power from. So it's not that we should be neutral Marxists or objective Marxists. I don't believe in that at all. I think that, yeah, Marxism is partial. It's a partial perspective, and it does have this thing of like, it thinks the whole within this perspective, and whatever is against that perspective can be included into that perspective, right? It's a bit like psychoanalysis in that sense, right? Like, if you're against psychoanalysis, well, a psychoanalyst is very interested in that because, oh, what is the unconscious dynamics happening there that you are against it, right? So, and this is also a trap with psychoanalysis. But Marxism, as you said, so new atheism doesn't get to the critique of politics, but Marxism does. So it's not just that Marxism is politics; it's a critique of politics, which is a very important distinction, right? Like, Marxism emerged with, German idealism, political economy, and utopian socialism. It was inspired by that, but it was at the same time a critique of all these three traditions. So yeah, I think that's what we should be doing. We should critique the left. We should critique the left, and we might blame the left also for its failure. But as leftists, as Marxists, and that is our position. So yeah, and so there is no guarantees here. Like, I think what we shouldn't do, or what we should actively avoid and catch ourselves in doing, is having Marxism as a standard against which we measure things, or especially having communism as a standard against which we measure things, right? So I think we shouldn't look at our society and be like, well, in communism, because class relations would be abolished, this wouldn't be a problem anymore. For example, sexual difference, right? Like, how does Marxism relate to questions of the family, as you've already pointed at, or questions of the inherent, let's say, the inherent inequality of sexual difference, right? Which of course means that we have to think about envy, we have to think about resentment, and the fact that these things won't leave. These things won't leave, right? And so we can't say, oh, it's because of capitalism, and that after capitalism, these things will not be there anymore. If anything, as Zizek says,
they're not a function.
They will explode.
No. Yeah.
Yeah,
they're not.
They will explode.
They're not reducible to that. They're not reducible to that. Yeah.
No.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this critique of the left as a leftist is kind of where I've been since 2016, which is basically, I feel like, in my tracking. And this is Catrone said he called the death of the millennial left in 2017. So it tracks like with my intuition of things, that I guess I was a millennial leftist till like 2016. And then in 2016, I was like, okay, I'm just going to be a critical leftist from a leftist point of view. And that sort of coincides with what I've seen since 2016 as this, I see like the counterculture as right wing now. And the left is like progressive leftism as kind of like, there's a form of progressive leftism where when they talk to you about what they're concerned about or how they frame the world, you can do nothing but just roll your eyes because they just don't get it. And they're not willing. You know what it is? It's that they actually don't want to understand the psychological motivations of the countercultural right. Like, they don't want to understand what the actual psychological motivations of the countercultural right are on the level of beauty, on the level of race, on the level of sex, on the level of gender. all of these things. They present impossible antinomies and problems for the millennial left and the progressive left that is too much influenced by the 1968 countercultural revolution in a poorly historically situated way, meaning that it's a form of the 1968 counterculture that doesn't fully situate itself in the context of 1789, 1848, 1917, and so forth, which I feel like is also the work we're building up towards, is situating that 1968 countercultural revolution properly historically, which could make it more robust. But the key thing here, as a critique of the left from a leftist point of view, as Marxist, like you say, to me, we're starting in the critique of the philosophy of right with the question of the family. And actually, and of course, there you get sexual difference and so forth, although Marx doesn't seem to talk too much about sexual difference, but he certainly does emphasize the family. And even like my first reading and like approach to interpreting the relationship between philosophy of right and critique of philosophy of right is that we could say that like Hegel kind of sees the family as the imaginary form in the equation of the ethical system. Like you have family, community, and state. And like you could like link this with Lacan's ISR triad. And you could say that Hegel is saying that the family is on the imaginary side, the community is on the symbolic side, like the mediation of language. And then the state is on the real side, the ethical ideal. The ethical realization is the real, that we can never escape, and we want to, we desire, we realize that. Like as the realist of our subjectivity is this dimension of the state. Now, where Marx kind of strawmans Hegel is that he kind of sees Hegel talking about the state as the absolute idea, and he doesn't enough emphasize how Hegel is thinking about the war between states. Like how Hegel's actually saying, no, the absolute is like this endless war of states. Like it's not like this beautiful absolute idea just in itself. So that's like Marx's straw man of Hegel. But at the same time, Marx is correct, I think, to say that the state can become a real, which actually destroys the family and destroys the ground of the actual human existence. And I think that that is true, what Marx is doing there. Like what he's saying is that, no, Hegel, the way you're conceiving the bourgeois state is super problematic from a historical point of view, because you're not questioning enough that the actual form of the state itself might need to change historically in time. And that if we're going to change the state historically in time, that it's going to require taking the real of human subjectivity on the level of family and community more seriously. Basically, this self-organizing working class idea, right? Like, which you don't find in Hegel. So I think that's super important. And like, basically what I see is like a meta transition going on in Marx and Hegel between the idea of a liberal state and the idea of a worker state. And how do you make that transition from a liberal state to a worker state? And that's kind of what still haunts us today and is going to become increasingly important in the context of these waves of industrial production, which, as you've mentioned already, threaten the foundation of labor in a quite, historically terrifying way for a lot of people, and coming up more and more. Now, I will say a few more things that, Mikey Downs was mentioning today, about the idea of hypermodernism and hyperpolitics, like from a Baudrillard point of view, where like we have extreme politics right now that's just virtual. Like, for example, the Kanye West thing on Twitter, right? Like that's hyper politics. Like it's like he's taking these extreme, absurd point of view, but the point that they're hyper politics is that they're not connected to party politics yet, right? Like Kanye West isn't connected to a party that supports these views, right? But he would like that, right? Like that's why he's like connecting to, like, he wants Elon Musk to pay attention to him because Elon Musk has party political power, right? So the question is whether all this extreme political gesturing online will become connected to party politics. And then like on the socialist communist side, like, will we actually have socialist and communist parties? Like, we see already the seed form of that, I think, in Bernie Sanders, because like people don't underestimate that when I was a boy, when I was growing up, um, the whole idea of an American presidential candidate calling themselves a socialist was unthinkable. Like, no American political candidate in the late 20th century could call themselves a socialist and survive. But Bernie Sanders does, and is supported. Whether or not he becomes the actual candidate and whether or not he actually becomes president is another thing. Whether we'll see a socialist president on the horizon of American capital, that's a open question. But I'm just saying that this is kind of what I'm paying attention to, is whether or not the extreme political ideation becomes connected to party politics or not. And what will be the results of that. But basically there is a breaking of a certain order that's going on, where the current, and this is kind of, and then I'll just throw it back to you, but like, this is kind of how I understand the Zizekian moment of philosophy. It's like in between the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the post-Cold War era, right? Like, you have the end of the Cold War and you have the universalization of American hegemony, global capitalism, and you have the realization that that order will not persist forever, but includes within itself fundamental contradictions, which will bring to the surface things that we have not wanted to think in the 19th and the 20th century about the fundamental form of the nation state, about industrial production, about fascism and communism. We haven't wanted to think about these things, not on the level of the real.
Oh man, it's so explosive, all of this, right? All that we're doing here. So I also want to have said that what I again appreciate about Philosophy Portal, especially this Marx course 101, is that we're gonna have a year long to think through these things, right? Like, we're not gonna rush it. We don't have to take firm political stances and then try to uphold them as much as we can. We can really lose ourselves in the confusion and go to history, not to get answers from history, but to see how did these people throughout their lives think about it, what in the whole ecology of Marxism happened to it, right? Like, side of philosophy, but also the practical politics, right? So Hegel, but also the working class movements. And today I was reading Mao Zedong. I was reading his. It's a two page text. I forgot the title, but it's about nuclear war and what if nuclear war will happen. So Mao starts speaking about Finland, and he says China and Finland have always had peaceful coexistence. Finland has never invaded China, and neither nor has China ever invaded Finland. But Great Britain, the Netherlands, Germany, the United States, and then he comes, all these European countries did invade China. They did terrorize China and wage war of aggression against China, all the while saying that China is waging war of aggression against them, right? So then he continues and he says that, uh, in the First World War, what happened? What happened is that at the end of the war, you had the Russian Revolution, and all of a sudden, a certain part of the globe called itself communist, right? They said, yeah, we have dictatorship of the proletariat now. We have a worker state. We are not going to go along with the global markets of capitalism. We're going to bend it to our will with violence against you, like the capitalists, right? So, okay, that happened. Then, Second World War. Mao Zedong says, Second World War made it so that Chiang Kai-shek and the Kuomintang lost. Now, also China was liberated. Also, Eastern European countries were liberated from Mao's perspective. And so Mao says, you know, we might have the US might start a third world war, and what will happen is, well, we'll have the headquarters of like a People's United Nations in New York itself. New York itself might be the headquarters for the communist world global republic. You know, why not? Mao says. And so Mao also says, you know, yeah, United States might bomb China with nuclear war, but we have hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of millions of people. Like, you guys are not going. Like, it might, you know, 100 million people might die, but we'll still be around. China was, and then Mao says, well, it might even be so that even if you kill everything, then in terms of not even world history, but the history of the universe, it will just be a tiny blip, you know? He's totally crazy. But what you can see
By
there
the
in the
way,
text of Mao.
I do want to say here, I'll let you go on, but I do want to say here that
Yeah,
I have always hated this cosmic perspective and the scale of the cosmic perspective
yeah,
as somehow leading to these conclusions of our meaninglessness, or that, oh, it's just 100 million people dying, but in the context of hundreds of billions of galaxies, what does it really
yeah,
matter? Like, this is such a stupid ideology, and it does, and it's stupid because it tries to impress you with its scientism, but it,
yeah.
anyway, we don't need to go into why it's not even scientifically interesting, but
It's
it's
false. Yeah,
just a very false way of thinking.
yeah. It's totally false, totally. And so, but what you could see with not only Mao, but people, communists were thinking like that, you know, before the two world wars and during them, that, yeah, you know, like, we'll have war and then we'll have revolution and then we'll win. But today we can't afford to think like that any longer. What does that mean? That means that we have to do the impossible, which means that we have to do revolution to prevent global war. That's the goal. I would say that's the communist. That's the first and foremost communist goal today, is to not have war so that we can do revolution, but to do revolution so we can prevent war, right? And Zizek's name of that is war communism, right? That's what prevents war. It's war communism, which means that, you know, if like, whatever will happen, economic crises, you know, natural catastrophes, huge migration waves, maybe mass unemployment, like, these things will totally dislocate nations and markets, and will ask of humanity to impose global measures, to impose global and, like, violent measures. We're talking about universal rationing. We're talking about talking about expropriation of property owners, of maybe even states. This is Zizek's idea of a global war communism, right? So it's not a great utopia that we'll move towards. It's like, and maybe this we should link this to Hegel's necessity of war above the nation states imposes the problem of communism upon us as a global civilization. And this today is what I would say that's what it means to do revolution before war. And you know, if it will not be, to make a long story short, if it will not be the left doing that, if it will not be the communists do that, it will surely be the right who will impose radical measures. The right might even do universal basic income when unemployment skyrockets to crazy extents. You know, like, we know you and everyone knows, like, just talk to the owners of, or look at what the owners of the AI companies are saying. Like, robotics and AI will keep advancing, developing, and unemployment will rise. So it we yeah, radical things will have to be radical measures will have to be enacted. The question is, who is going to do that with what kind of northern star? You know, what will it point us towards? Um, and so before giving it back to you, I want to put attention to one more thing, and that is that, how do we look at Hitler? You know, like, if you look at the economic crash of the end of the 20s, and if you look at the skyrocketing unemployment of Great Britain and France and Germany, the Germans with Hitler in power, solved the unemployment the quickest. If you just look at the crude statistics, the unemployment was going down much quicker than they did in Great Britain and in France. So, sometimes we have this cartoon idea of Hitler just said he wanted to go to war, and then people were like, yeah, we're gonna go to war or something. But no, it's like he solved, quote unquote, like, it's horrible to say it, but he solved problems in a very real sense for real people, that people felt that in their lives. And I'm not saying it was a great solution, but yeah, let's look at that. And I think war more so happens because we stumble upon it, right? We stumble upon war because it's very easy to unify as Europe if you have a common enemy, namely Russia or even the United States or China. Doesn't matter. Like, it's a good way of also getting rid of your surplus population, of getting rid of surplus labor, of getting rid of surplus industrial production, of solving issues of unemployment. To get into a war economy might actually stimulate the economy and might cause that people are, yeah, get housing again. And yeah, so these are really, like, these are, yeah, huge problems that
The thing
we have to
is,
think about.
the
Yeah.
the thing is, and the problem with the way most people conceive of liberalism is they conceive of liberalism as, like, let's say, the pleasure or the comfort or the happiness of my self-identity, as opposed to thinking liberalism in a Hegelian way, which is like struggling with our self-contradiction as positive. Like that's like probably the height of a liberal thinker. Like, the height of a liberal thinker is I'm struggling with my self-identity as a positive thing. Like, I'm blessed to be able to struggle with my self-identity, the war in my heart, and then collectively in liberal society, the war in our collective hearts. As opposed to the traditional way of thinking, which is struggling with a common enemy, right? Like, it's easy to unify on a common enemy and find unity that way. Like, I forget the podcast I was listening to, but people were talking about Russia, where they were saying, if you go to Russia, there are clean streets, there's full employment. The only thing is you just have to not talk about the war, right? Like, clean streets, full employment, everything's great, just don't talk about the war, right? And I think that this is kind of the challenge here that's before us. You also mentioned, you asked that question of how do we look at Hitler. This is coming up. Like, look at, again, what Kanye is doing with the meme of Hitler is, on the one hand, obviously terrifying and disturbing, and on the other hand, actually, like, genius and, like, strange in a cultural sense, where he's short-circuiting Nazi identity and Black identity. Like, he's just like he's like forcing, like, the ultimate contradiction of the social substance, like, just to the forefront, and just like saying things that are like the most massive possible contradiction. He's like saying, oh, you think only white people can hate Jews? Like, Black people can hate Jews just as much. And there are these, like, strange posters that, like, you'll see these posters, like, these people exist. I'm saying, like, there are people that exist that say, we need white and Black unity against the common enemy. you know It's like, we're fighting each other, but we really shouldn't be fighting each other, because that's the real enemy. It's like, but it's strange. Like, it's this transposition of the common enemy, like, it's shifting around the common enemy, right? Instead of, like, locating the common enemy in the self-contradiction of our identities and our collective identities. So this is all important to think, because Catrone was even saying in our portal sessions, he said, if the left doesn't do it, the right will. To your point about the war communism and the extreme measures, I think this is the next 3 years the left has to think from that perspective. If the left doesn't do it, the right will. And if the left fails, the right will be the reaction to it. Right? So that's also the scary thing that looms over the left, is like, if the left is bold and if the left fails, which is likely, then the right will surely do some simpler, more devastating thing. So, and that's also like, someone was trying to hystericize Zizek on his love for communist aesthetics. And his response was like, of course, like, not to the point, but like bringing us to the actual point. Like, not like dealing with like this person trying to strawman him on his cultural aesthetic preferences, but like trying to bring us to like what is actually interesting and to think in Stalinism and communism. That he said that there's something more traumatic in the Russian Revolution and its historical legacy than anything like the National Socialist Revolution. He says the National Socialist Revolution is just a basic conservative model for revolution, but that the Russian Revolution presents something of a qualitatively different aim and hope, which, again, I think you've already pointed towards it in the way Zizek's trying to deal with Lenin. He's not like necessarily saying like, oh, we need to redo what Lenin did exactly, but that there's a form that was attempted, which will, like we always say, continues to haunt us and so forth like this. And of course, his formulation of it, and he was always criticized before openly formulating this of like not proposing any practical political agenda. But war communism is something that he started proposing, at least in my tracking of Zizek's writings, from basically the coronavirus times. Because before the coronavirus times, he was doing the commons problems thing. Like, we have a bunch of commons problems. We have technological problems. We have ecological problems. We have social problems that require common frame that can't be solved basically within the coordinates of nation states and global capitalism. But he didn't propose what the frame should be. He just mainly said we have like a coordination problem of the commons before us. But then since coronavirus, he started doing the war communism thing, which in a way is interesting for this reason. The pre-Russian Revolution Marxist consciousness is very utopian optimistic, right? It's very positivistic, humanistic, optimistic, right? Then I've been tracking that since World War I and the Russian Revolution, this is no longer tenable, this way of thinking. Because of the violence and because of the destruction of our ideals, where our best intentions turn into their worst nightmare. Right. So it's no longer tenable to think in that way. And then, you have people who often we collaborate with who are studying like from the Frankfurt School tradition, like Adorno's negative dialectics, where basically you have this idea of like the impossibility of world communism and utopian positivity, and you just can kind of get sucked into this negativist universal, like this negativist universal black hole, where you find people like Frederick Jameson, where you find people like Mark Fisher, and even up to a certain point, we can say we find people like Slavoj Žižek, in the sense of a negative universality of like it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. That's basically the negative. That's like, I think, the slogan. Like, I think that's the slogan of the negative universal. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. But then Zizek, like Mark Fisher proposed acid communism, right? Like, which is acid communism is very much an idea that's inspired by the 1968 countercultural revolutionary space, right? And even like people at Zero Books, like I talked to Mike Watson, Brahmi Gieben, they're in the portal, and Mike Watson even told me in the podcast with him that he doesn't really have any hope in acid communism. Right? Like, he doesn't really see it like, oh, this is Fisher's project where if we just continue to bring it out, like maybe there's some emancipatory potentials here. He doesn't think that. Right? It's so the idea of war communism, though, the idea of war communism seems distinctly different from those ideas. And it's kind of like Zizek's like political offering, like in the context of this entire madness, right? And I think that it does pose us the correct coordinates for what we might face in the 21st century in regards to the explosion of a commons problem, which requires global coordination in some way. And the best example, I think, is COVID in our history, where there was a global problem that just required some higher coordination. And I think that's like, to me, that's the forcing function. Like, it's either something like that will cause war, or something like that will cause war communism. Right? Like, so that's like I think that's like the coordinates we're heading towards. And then I do want to say that our blindness to Marxism from the Russian Revolution, to me, I'm not going to say let's just blame Lenin, but I do think that that move of trying to do communism without the liberal democratic state of capital, like just going straight from a peasantry to world communism, I do think that that has an increased probability of just leading to a reactionary national socialism, right? Like, and by national socialism, I just mean like Stalin's idea of socialism in one country, right? Like that's basically what that's national. Like, it might not be the exact same as the fascist form of national socialism, where I take the national form, sorry, the fascist form of national socialism to be basically like an ethnically rooted populism, right? Like, I've been listening to people in the UK who are on the reformist side say basically that we need a nativism. Like, we need an England for English people, which basically means we need an England for white people who have their ancestry in Great Britain stretching back for the last few centuries, right? And like, anyone who doesn't have that ethnic composition, England does not belong to them, right? And then he even started doing, I've seen people doing these Google Maps overview, where you can do a look at the ethnic distribution of certain regions of the country. And he's basically referring to regions which have a very high level of non-English ethnicity to be an infestation. This is an infestation. And he even starts to describe it like a cancer. Like, this is the spread of the infestation, you know? And then you could imagine that in the 21st century, it would be different than the 21st century, because you get like this pan-European fascism, like where you have all these different like pockets of ethnic reformists, like linking up in a EU. Like, this is where like the left can always lead to right-wing reactions, where you could say like the EU is like a progressive entity, like, let's bring all the nation states together for a continental unity. But then you can have these distributed right-wing ethnic populists building within it some sort of fascist coalition that's much different than the German, 1930s type of organization. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, Europe is in a very strange place, because it is a world power, but it is also not a world power, right? United States, biggest military. The dollar is the US, is the global reserve currency, right? So if you want to do international trade, you have to go through the dollar, which gives them an immense leverage, right? China has their own ecosystem digitally, right? China owns WeChat. All the Chinese media are owned by Chinese nationals and the Chinese
All
state.
their social media, right? Like, it's not
Yes.
like a techno-feudal model.
It is a techno-feudal. It's just with Chinese characteristics.
Okay.
So it is, but it is techno-feudal, and Musk is actually trying to emulate what the Chinese are doing, which is like, that's the interesting thing. The Chinese are ahead in certain sense in how centralized their techno-feudal platforms are. But Europe doesn't have this, right? Europe has no big hardware industry. It has no big tech giants. Um, which mean and so let's look at this. So what is the biggest investment that the Trump regime announced? The biggest investment is called the Stargate project, right? Which is an investment of $500 billion into infrastructure for AI and also robotics, but mainly AI, which consists of data centers, which are, as we speak, being built in Texas and so on, which like super tight schedules. They're going with lightning speed building this stuff. What's the biggest recent investment and the biggest investment proposal of the EU that was just accepted a few months ago that they ever did? It's well, actually, I'm not sure. Maybe the COVID packages were a bit more, but anyway, for as of recent times, it's 800 billion in a program called Rearm Europe, and this is very interesting because where is this money gonna go to? You know, of course, we don't. The EU doesn't have this money. We have to borrow lots of it. Maybe they're gonna implement euro bonds. It's not sure. But it looks like we're gonna buy American weapons, American artillery, American all of this, right? So we'll have machines running on Microsoft. We'll have machines running on Amazon Web Services. Like the digital commons is really such a crucial site of struggle today on a global scale, and it is how we relate to ourselves, right? Talking about struggling with self-contradiction as a positive, like digital commons is what? It's about family, it's about friendship, but it's also about civil society, it's about business, right? But it's also about the state. How do you pay your taxes? How do you vote? Well, today in Estonia, you vote online, right? And this is gonna be everywhere, right? No, what it's not gonna hold back digitalization. So, I think we have to think the fact that to put it simply, like we are not prepared for what is coming to us with the enclosure of the commons, which is called technofeudalism. Like the censorship, the AI driven algorithms, you know, with which determine what we see, what we don't see, who we meet, who we don't meet, how networks and relations will develop, right, day in and day out. Like how do you feel on a by what you see on the internet. Like these are owned by American big tech giants, and I mean, radical measures can be implemented to to liberate them. Talking from a liberal perspective, like to liberate them from certain techno-feudal constraints, which is all. What about this book by Yanis Varoufakis is, you know, Technofeudalism, and I take this book to be such an important contribution to today's conversation. Uh, Yanis Varoufakis is very well aware that it is very radical to say that techno-feudalism killed capitalism and that capitalism is actively being replaced. But I don't really think it's so interesting to ask the question, is techno-feudalism replacing capitalism or is it not replacing capitalism? I think we should think about techno-feudalism on the level of what you just mentioned, namely that Zizek or Jameson said, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. Now, Zizek has actually been writing about this lately, and now he rejects this. He says, no, we shouldn't imagine things. We should look as best as we can into how capitalism works, into the immanence of the capital labor logic. And that's actually, I think that's like communist activism, right? Like to choose to critique politics on this level of capitalism and not to be stuck in how do we imagine imagine the way forward. Of course, there's an important place for imagining revolution, you know. And the final chapter of Varoufakis' book does go into a model of resistance to techno-feudalism, which is a kind of form of democratic techno-socialism. Now, like, is that something that we have to go forward with? I think, you know, with this Marx 101 course, we'll have and develop the tools to really think
Yeah.
through all of these aspects.
We need to,
Yeah.
yeah, that's, I think, a good place to sort of point towards a closing, which is that in Real Speculations, I do explicitly talk about things like technofeudalism and technosocialism, but the but I do it in a very speculative, almost ungrounded way, in only in the way in which Real Speculations isn't fundamentally engaging with Marx. Like, it's primarily, like, again, the main sort of triad, or the main, sections of the book are mostly informed by the primary sources of Hegel, Nietzsche, and Lacan. So there is a way in which, and you've already picked this out, and you're developing this in an article that I hope we'll be able to discuss in the near future, that this move at Philosophy Portal of going from Hegel to Marx is a fundamental one. And I do think that we need to go deep into this in order to really make more clear, how do we conceive of techno-feudalism, and how do we possibly think about something like a techno-socialism. And I even have early thoughts, because just even yesterday I was meeting with Michel Bowens, who's obviously a great theorist of the commons, to reference what you were pointing towards with the digital commons. And the commons is, at the end of the day, a mode of what he calls a contributive economy. And a contributive economy that is very much what we're already doing, he says. Like, I tried to say, like, okay, but how do I think more about your model of the commons in regards to what I'm basically doing? And he said, you're already doing it. Like, you're already, like, functioning in a way towards a contributive economy. And he said that we just need to think in things of, like, how do families function? Like, families, he says, naturally function more as a protection from capitalism, in terms of being a contributive economy. How do friendships function? Right? So how do family function? How does friendships function? And then how do communities function? And the thing is, and I was talking with Helen Rollins as well, no emancipatory politics without family, we said. We agreed on that axiom. So you have family. I think Daniel Tutt would also agree with that you have family, you have friendship, then you have community, and then you have the community of communities, which we've also been doing at the portal with our Building the Milieu work this year, which has to become the basis for civil society. And even I got Michel Bowens to agree that the question of the state is still before the commons. Like, for him, like, when I was telling him about the difference between Hegel and Marx on a liberal state versus a workers' state, he said that for him it is a question of the common state, or how can we commonify the state. Like, that's the language he would want to use. So that to me is, like, in the mix. Like, when we think about commonifying the state for the digital commons, this is something that to me would be very much in the conversation about technosocialism. So getting these languages, and I'll just say as a final thing that if you're interested in joining the early Marx course, it's running throughout the year. We're going to do one text by Marx a month, most of his texts from the 1840s, but you also get access to specific sessions in the portal, which are geared towards theories of Marxism, socialism, communism. So you get access to the Chris Catrone months, which were recorded in February around his book Marxism and Politics. You get access to the Revol Press month, which is currently unfolding in the portal, which is basically under a model of Gothic capitalism. And we'll be exploring some of their texts, which are, they're a collective publishing house. They're focused on countercultural dreaming. They're very much interested in aesthetics. And so that's part of the Marxism, that is a part of the early Marx 101 course as well. And then you also get access to the month in September with Michel Bowens, where we're going to be going into his theory of the commons. And if you live in Europe, we're actually going to be doing a live event at the Brussels Commons Hub, where Dimitri will be there as well. And we are going to be actually connecting with people who are trying to build a commons in Europe. Right? So this is, very much work where there's actual connections here. There's actual physical grounding here. And you can get involved here. And then there will be a fourth portal session that you'll be able to get access to, which I cannot yet announce who it will be, but I can announce that it will be at the intersection of emancipatory politics and psychoanalysis. So you get all of that. It's a year-long course. We're taking our time with it, as Dimitri said, and that is a principle of philosophy portal, patience of the concept. If this sounds attractive to you, if these are ideas that are meaningful for you, ideas like technofeudalism, technosocialism, digital commons, emancipatory politics, Hegel and Marx, all of that is what we're going to be exploring this year. And Dimitri, I'll let you give the final word, what you're thinking, maybe what you're looking forward to, and I anticipate that we'll be having a few more conversations like this throughout the year, just inspired by our work here.
Yeah, I'm so excited for this. It's so alive today. This is really the conversation that we need to have, and I like Zizek's saying that actually hard work and discipline are leftist. Like these are communist ideas, and that's what we should really go for. We don't have to enjoy; we just have to work hard and show discipline, and whatever fruits it will bear, that we'll see about that. So yeah, excited to see.
All right, everyone, it's been Dimitri Crooijmans. Early Marx 101 starts Sunday, June 9th, extends throughout the entire year. Links will be in the description, philosophyportal.online, and we're out. Early Marx 101 is the next big Philosophy Portal course. The course starts June 9th and will unfold throughout the rest of 2025. The course will include 7 lectures on the early Marx's writings from 1840s and include discussions and Q&A opportunities, indefinite access to recordings, as well as special access to portal sessions related to Marxism, capitalism, and socialism. Philosophy Portal courses also lead to opportunities to learn presentation skills and writing opportunities at our conferences and anthologies. Work at this theopolitical edge on these topics is more important than ever, and without engagement with the specific historical contradictions that appear at the site of modern democracy and industrial capitalism, we'll be unable to address or adequately engage with them. To learn more about the Early Marx 101 course or to sign up, visit philosophyportal.online.